Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem. Welcome to Mount Zion. This place has deep biblical significance as well as a rich and inspiring Messianic Jewish history. When the Bible speaks of Zion or Mount Zion, it is oftentimes speaking of a prophetic destiny, a future, a time in which the Messiah will be ruling and reigning here from Jerusalem. The prophet Isaiah gives us a glimpse into this when he says that the nations will say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion will go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem." The prophet Zechariah says that the Lord will return to Zion and make Jerusalem his home, and Jerusalem will be a holy city. These scriptures and many more are the scriptures that Messianic Jewish pioneer Pauline Rose read that inspired her to come and be a part of that reality. She came here first, just prior to the War of Independence in 1948, to establish the presence of Messiah here in Jerusalem. She came here to light the light of Messiah and to be a source of encouragement to the fledgling community. She wanted to be a part of the reality of the state of Israel in its rebirth. In her book, Siege of Jerusalem, she tells of her time here in Jerusalem during the siege in which Jerusalem became an independent state.
I wanted to come here because I had the vision of Mount Zion and what it means. Mount Zion, we are told, is the place that God chose for his dwelling place, the place where the blessings would go out to all the world, the place where he would have his house of prayer, where all nations would flow into it. So we felt that we would like to have a house on Mount Zion, which would be a center, a place for all people to come. And if God would help us, it would be a place of peace and joy and blessing. When I went to ask the authorities if we could come and live here, they all were aghast and said, "Of course not, it's impossible. We can't have people living here because it is a holy sanctuary, and we can't have people living here because of the dangers. We wouldn't be responsible for anyone living here." But I believe that what is impossible with man is possible with God. And if God would want us to come and live here, then it would be made possible. So I waited and I asked, and the impossible became possible. After a long struggle and many difficulties and many refusals, we got permission to live here. And then it was a matter of finding the place where we could live. Finally, I saw this house, which was right on the border and almost out of bounds, and was in a very bad state of ruin because soldiers had been in here fighting in the War of Independence. And then it was left like that for 17 years. But I felt this was the right house, right on the top of Mount Zion, and with a wonderful view facing the Mount of Olives, the Kidron Valley, the Judean hills, and in the distance, the mountains of Moab, and in between was the Dead Sea. After a long struggle and many difficulties and many obstacles, we were allowed to have this house. And one of the great problems was how to get here, because the only way up to Mount Zion was by the steps. And the only other way was a very rough, potholed military track which came up round the mountain and was used only by the soldiers. And this road was barred and locked, and no one was allowed to come on it. So we had another big fight to see if we could get the key of the barrier and be able to use this road. Otherwise, how would we be able to restore this ruined building, bringing up building materials, which would have to be brought up on a donkey's back up the steps? Finally, we won with the military, and they gave us the key on the condition that it never passed out of our hands. When we tried the road, it was such a bad road that our car nearly went to pieces on its first journey. So we thought, well, we'll have to have a jeep, the same way as the soldiers. But if we have permission to live here, then we felt that God had made the impossible possible, and whatever the difficulties may be, we must come here. And just at that time, the Pope decided to come to Israel. So this rough military road was turned into an asphalted road in a few weeks, so that the Pope and his entourage could drive up to the top of Mount Zion. And I was very thankful to the Pope, because he made our coming here so much easier. Another thing which was in my vision was a garden. In the Bible it says, "Make the place of my sanctuary beautiful." And I believe that Mount Zion is the place of God's sanctuary. So I thought, if we can start by making a garden in order to beautify one small part of Mount Zion, that might later grow and the whole of Mount Zion would become a garden and beautiful. So we had to start removing lorry loads of rubble, stones and rubbish which had been here for hundreds of years, and replacing that by loads of good soil, by building up the walls, the steps and the entrance to the house. After 5 months, we were able to come and live in this house, and we were able to begin that which we hoped would grow here. We gave the house the name Ha-Ohel, which is the tent, the name of Abraham's tent in the wilderness, where all strangers were received with love and a welcome, and we hoped that the blessing that the people had in Abraham's tent would also come upon this house.
Pauline and Albert Rose's dream was finally realized in 1964. With great persistence, they had established the Ha-Ohel, the place of meeting, the tent, here on Mount Zion. It wasn't a tent, it was their home, it was their garden. It was the fulfillment of their vision to create a place of sweet fellowship, of dialogue between Jews, Arabs, and Christians. In her books, she tells of amazing stories and accounts of the fellowship that took place in her home over Sabbath meals, over a cup of tea, or simply by giving a visitor to Mount Zion a drink of water to parch their dry mouth. She made an impact in people's lives. She made a difference. And despite this being a military zone prior to 1967, this was an IDF army base. The Jordanians were just sitting 100 yards away at the border. The Jordanian soldiers stood atop the rooftops or on the top of the walls of the old city, guns in the ready. This was a place of danger. It was a place in which put people's lives in jeopardy, but yet she and Albert pioneered to create a haven of peace here on Mount Zion. Her books tell us the stories of Albert coming to this rooftop and praying. This is what I like to call the pre-67 kotel. This is where devout Jews would come pray. It was the closest location that Jews could come to the old city, to the Temple Mount, facing the Temple Mount, and appealing to God, pleading with God to bring His kingdom, to establish His throne, to bring peace. And from this location, Albert and his friends, his fellow Jews, would go to his home. They would sit at the Sabbath table. Christians would come, Arabs would come, and sweet dialogue would take place. But as I said, this was prior to 1967, prior to the War of '67. Let's listen to Pauline Rose's account of that war in 1967 and ultimately the reunification of Jerusalem.
The soldiers asked us to leave here a few days before when things looked a little bit serious, but we said we would prefer to stay here. We realized that it was a danger zone and a battle zone, but we had no fears, so we asked if we could remain here. We thought perhaps we may be, in some way, we may be able to be of use. And very reluctantly they agreed, but they would not allow us to stay in this house because it was the most exposed place on Mount Zion. The Jordanian military posts were very near us, facing us and on either side of us. So they insisted that we go into a building at the back of our house, which was a little safer. On the morning of June the 5th, we had this battle. The soldiers were all around us, firing from above us, on each side of us, here on Mount Zion, and the shells and the bullets coming from the other side. The noise was terrible, and really it sounded as though the whole of Mount Zion would be destroyed. This went on for 2 days and 2 nights with hardly a stop. I hadn't had time to take in provisions, and there was no water, but during a little lull in the battle, I went across and got in a little food. I managed to grab a saucepan from the stove with potatoes, which had started cooking on Monday morning, and we managed to finish that off, and we thoroughly enjoyed our meal, as we hadn't had anything to eat for nearly 24 hours. The shelling and the battle continued without a stop until the morning of the 7th of June. And then it died down a little. At the same time, there were many new soldiers coming up to Mount Zion. They were very tired and weary, as they hadn't had anything to drink or perhaps to eat for quite some time. So we managed to make them some coffee before they went in. Before they had finished their coffee, the commander of the unit came to me and said, "We are now going into the old city from this side. Our soldiers are also going in from the other parts. And we have no flag, and we must have a flag with us. But we have no time to lose. What can you do to help us?" So I rushed upstairs, and I pulled a sheet out of the cupboard, and I happened to have a tube of blue paint, and very quickly on the kitchen table we did the Magen David in this blue paint on the sheet, rushed downstairs, pulled a stick out of the garden to which we attached it, and they rolled it up and went down with their half-tracks and jeeps into the old city, through the border from Mount Zion. That was a great moment, and we wondered what would happen, and what would happen to that flag. Later we learned that that was the flag which they put up on the Tower of David when they conquered the city.
It seems odd that a flag of war would come from this house of peace. It should be inspiring and encouraging for us to hear the history, to hear our Messianic Jewish history, and to see Pauline Rose's involvement in the creation of the banner that announced the reunification of Jerusalem to the people of Israel. Pauline Rose's story didn't end there. Her garden to this day continues to serve as a place of peace, of shalom and beauty here on top of Mount Zion. The fruit trees that she planted, they continue to bear forth luscious and delicious fruit. The flowers that she planted continue to blossom in great beauty. She created a haven of peace. Her home to this day is used as a place of discussion amongst Jewish and Arabs about peace and bringing peace to Jerusalem, to Israel, and ultimately to the world. I hope that you have found her story encouraging and strengthening. I hope that each one of us can gain a sense of mission and purpose by seeing Pauline Rose's life of devotion and faithfulness, and to see how one simple thing like a garden can blossom into a lifelong testimony, a legacy. May each one of us be inspired by her life and do something great for the kingdom of heaven. Shalom from Jerusalem.